Hello and welcome to our program Where God Weeps, a program where we talk about the situation of the suffering church around the world. China, in the 21st century, has had an amazing transformation in its economy, education, international relations. All have changed. But what has happened in terms of religious freedom? Are Chinese people free to live and express their beliefs? To know more about the situation of Christians in China, it is my privilege to welcome Professor Fenggang Yang, author and scholar of Perdue University. Professor, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Professor, the title of one of your books, Religion in China, Survival and Revival and Communist Rule. That's an interesting combination of words. Why do you choose to define your study with such words?
Well, because as you may know, China once banned all religions. And it was a question that was very interesting to me. How did religion survive those eradication period in the 1960s and the 1970s?
During the Cultural Revolution
right,
and all that.
Right. Once the Cultural Revolution started, all churches and the temples and the mosques were closed down. And then when I began to do my research in China, all over China, in 2000, I saw religion really became very lively. You know, how did religion survive first, then revive in China? So that's the topic. And of course, the social context is under communist rule. I try to offer a sociological explanation about how did that religion survive and revive under communist rule. And this speaks to the sociological theories because until recently, scholars in social sciences or social philosophy all predict that religion will decline and disappear. And certainly in China, the ideology of the Communist Party believed that religion will decline and will disappear. But I offered an alternative theory to explain how come religion survived this eradication and has come back. And that theory, we apply some economic terms to explain that. There are people, many people have the demand for religion. They have desire for religion, religious beliefs, religious rituals, and religious belong to a community.
Yeah, some people even have defined it as a religious instinct.
Right, yes, so exactly. So because people have that desire and the demand, then religion, you cannot really wipe this out from people's mind and people's heart. So eventually this dynamic of demand and supply drives the changes in China in the last several decades.
Oh, very interesting. So that's why you mentioned that you incorporated into your research some economic terms of offer and demand, and that's how...
Right.
Now, Professor, the actual constitution in China grants freedom of religion, but you have to comply with the regulations. So is that really religious freedom, or is it just a way of playing with words?
Well, you have to understand constitution in China is a new concept to the Chinese. It's a modern thing. Even though China has a civilization for thousands of years, but constitution is new. It's only about 100 years old. So yes, in the constitution there is a article saying we has the freedom of religious belief. But constitution does not really get implemented in real life. There's a gap between constitutional ideals and the reality. in reality was governed is really by religious policies of the government or directives of the Communist Party. So the constitution is up there, but the reality is more by the rules of the Communist Party.
One very relevant aspect of the patriotic associations is that they encourage these groups of religious people in China to avoid a particular foreign influence. For instance, the situation of the Holy Father, the Pope, with Catholics, but the same situation with the Dalai Lama and Buddhism. What are the consequences of this, Professor?
Well, I think you're talking about this so-called three self principles. For Christian churches, since 1949, especially in the early 1950s, the policies, the government, the party state want the Christian churches to be self-governed, self-support, and self-propagation. That self means by the Chinese, not foreigners, not foreign religious bodies like the Vatican or other religious organizations. So this, the historical context is that there was a, the Chinese communists led the movement in China, the revolution is, part of that is so-called imperialism. So there's a foreign influence considered imperial influence. So it's better to have the Chinese independence. But if this policy principle had any merit in the 1950s, I think nowadays is clearly it has become outdated. This is a globalization era. Nobody can live in isolation, especially those Christian churches. They are part of the global church or global bodies. And it's not reasonable to totally cut off their ties. Once they are cut off the ties, actually this has negative consequences. Because churches for example, talking about the Roman Catholic Church, and there was the Vatican Council II, the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. And because the Chinese Catholic Church cut off the ties, the formal ties with Vatican, so what happened to the Vatican Council II? The Chinese Catholics didn't know about it, so it still, maintained the liturgy and other ways pre-Vatican II. When I visited churches, in the 1980s, 1990s, even 2000, I still see the Chinese Catholic churches very much pre-Vatican II. Right.
Vatican II.
Right. So actually, if better integrated, the Chinese Catholic Church would be more, come along this line of changes of the whole church, the whole general churches.
Now, bringing also these concepts to concrete examples, there is this situation also of conflict between the ordination of bishops, between the Holy See, and what the Chinese government wants to happen in this regard. Can you explain us about this phenomenon, this situation, this conflict?
Yes, because the Chinese communists perceive this approval of bishops by the Holy See as an intrusion of Chinese internal affairs. So that they insist, no, the Chinese bishops' conference have to come up their own ordination requirements without accepting the approval or disapproval of the Vatican. I think this basically, I see this as first started with misunderstanding. Don't understand what is the Roman Catholic Church. If you cut off your ties with the Vatican, then you are no longer really Roman Catholic Church. You can be Catholic of under other name. But on a deeper level, I see that the Communist Party wants to claim authority, and the Chinese Catholics should be loyal to China, especially the Communist Party. And when the Chinese Catholics express their loyalty to the Pope, they see this as a competition of loyalty. They want one loyalty, and that loyalty should be to China, and particularly to the Chinese Communist Party. So this becomes a power struggle.
And this has developed what in Western societies we know as the underground church and the official church. What is the conflict between? Is there a conflict between these two groups?
Of course, there are certainly tensions, disagreements between the Catholic Church under the Patriotic Association, that's government approved. Then there's an underground church that the bishops and priests are still loyal to the Pope. And because in China there are, in many dioceses, you have both bishops. So the bishops are approved by the Chinese government and the bishops approved by the Vatican. Then yes, sometimes they have some conflict. It's true. It's quite common.
Professor, after all the research that you've done, do you consider that Christianity is persecuted in China? And I know that this is a very blunt, direct question that might not be that simple, but what would be your diagnosis in this regard?
Well, I think there is a certain level of persecution. That is suppression without a legal basis. Or, in the last 2 years, for example, the government ordered to demolish some churches, some church buildings, and taking down crosses from church rooftops. And this
under what excuse, Professor? What was the pretext?
Well, when Zhejiang province started this campaign, it's all in the name of for the landscape, for better look of the overall city. But that's really not really justifiable reason.
Of course.
Because it's all started by the governor or the provincial leaders who see crosses so visible in the city and simply they didn't like it. That's why they want to remove the crosses. And when the churches resisted this order, they said, well, either you keep the church or you keep the cross. You cannot keep both. So that's why some of the large churches are totally demolished when they refused to get their cross taken down. I think this is persecution. It's not really reasonable governance. And some of the leaders who resisted were, they were jailed. And there are economic sanctions against them. So in that regard, I would say yes, there are persecutions.
Up to this date, there are still prisoners because of their faith?
I would say so, even though the government would refuse to say so. They always find guilt on other terms, economic crimes or other crimes rather than religious crimes. Because the Chinese Constitution guarantees freedom of religious beliefs. Now, if you have a religious belief or practice, they wouldn't say you are a criminal. But they will find a way to get some of the religious leaders who are not so cooperative with the government.
So that's why we see some of them under house arrest.
Right. Yes. For example, the Bishop of Shanghai Diocese, when he was installed as the bishop, he said, now I'm a bishop, I'm too busy with the church affairs. I would like to withdraw from the Patriotic Association. And immediately after his installment, he was put into house arrest. And also, like in Beijing, there's the Protestant church called the Shouwang Church. They were evaded from their rental place, and they purchased a hall for their worship service, but they were not given, the keys were held, not given to them. And those, the Shouwang Church pastor has been under house arrest since 2011. he cannot really get out of his apartment because there are people outside his apartment preventing him from leaving. Yes, this still happens.
And now, one of the more powerful efforts of control, I think, what I see is this initiative of the government of creating, we might say, their own Christian theology or something that it's related with Chinese values, but more than Chinese values, it's actually values of the Communist Party. But can you tell us a little bit about this initiative of making Chinese Christian theology?
I think this is just, from the Christian side. Christian leaders, Christian theologians, they themselves have been trying to contextualize, indigenize. That's from their own logic. They do this.
The enculturization that happens in every part of the world.
Right. So that's not the real issue. The issue is what has been imposed onto Christians, saying you have to contextualize your theology this way, by this political pressure. I think that's the problem. Among the Protestants, there has been this, they called the campaign of reconstructing theology and now making Christianity Chinese. This is very much a political effort, and the goal is also clear, is to make Chinese Christians loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, ultimately. So there are two parts about Chinese theology. If it comes from Chinese Christians themselves, they have been doing this before the communists came. And alongside of the communists, they are already making this effort. But the goal of the government's campaign to make Chinese Christians Chinese is political. So there are two things. These two things are often intertwined, makes it so difficult to talk about it. But one example is among the Protestant sects that existed before 1949. That's when the communists took power in mainland China. They were very much indigenous. They didn't have much connections with foreign religious bodies. But those sects were banned by the communist authorities. Right. So if it's really for making Christianity suit to the Chinese culture, Chinese situation, then those should be role models rather than ban them. So that clearly shows this campaign is really political.
Now, Professor, there are two, I think, important religious groups that they are not officially recognized in China. One is the Jewish faith and also Orthodox. Isn't this literally a violation of human rights?
Well, the situation about the Orthodox Church is changing because China and Russia relations are getting better. So now the Orthodox Church is allowed to operate in certain cities, like in Harbin, in Beijing, in Shanghai. And recently even had a priest ordained in Russia, a Chinese, who will go back to China. But the legal status of the Orthodox Church is still unclear because according to the regulations, only 5 religions are allowed, and that does not include Orthodox Christianity. Judaism, that's even more interesting because Judaism is a religion, but they say, China does not have Jews, so Judaism is not a legalized religion. Are these
even though it's one of the oldest communities of Jewish people in the history of Judaism?
Yeah, there are in Henan, in Kaifeng city of Henan province, there are descendants of Jews. Yeah, I have interviewed some of them. These are descendants of Jews who have lost the faith and lost the practice. They still maintain certain cultural things from Judaism. That's the problem. When they try to go back to their roots to learn Judaism, the government tries to say, no, this Judaism is not one of our recognized religions. So are these things against human rights? I think so. Yes, religious freedom is part of human rights. There should not be limiting the number of religions, right? People have the right to choose their own religions. So the government should get out of the business of saying which religions is allowed, which religions is not allowed.
Yeah, it's not a menu that you say, okay, you can choose from these 5 and nothing else.
Right.
Professor, I don't want to end our conversation without looking into the future. Mm-hmm. Christianity is growing in China, and China itself, it's a giant in the world, not only in terms of their economy, but their international influence, and of course the population. So, with your expertise, how do you foresee the future of Christianity in China, and what would be the impact of this development in Christianity around the world?
Yes, Christianity has been growing very fast in China since around 1980. So in the last 35 years, the annual growth rate of the number of Christians on average is more than 10% each year.
That's amazing.
Yes, it's really amazing. So the total number of Christians, according to some conservative estimate today, is 67 million total. That includes 9 million Catholics and 58 million Protestants. But back in 1980, there were only 3 million Catholics and 3 million Protestants. And from that, 6 million now is 67 million. So see, the growth rate is really fast. And I see the trend, if that continues, by 2030, there will be more Christians in China than any other country in the world, including the U.S. In the U.S., you include all Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians. By 2030, there will be more Christians in China than in the U.S. I think this change is just so fast. Many people have not realized. And so we haven't really given careful thought about the consequences this will bring. I think first of all, the challenge to the Chinese authorities. Now, the party state trying to slow down this growth, trying to take control, but I think it's already beyond the point of control. Because you cannot slow down. When they imprison a pastor during this demolition campaign, that pastor in prison for 1 year, he converted fellow prisoners. He came to contact with 180 people. According to his own testimony, among these 180 people, 100 of them converted to Christianity. And the other 60 of them expressed interest in Christianity. Only 20 of them refused. So if conversion happens even in prisons, then you can imagine on university campuses, in neighborhoods, in villages, in communities. So the rapid growth of Christianity in China is most likely will continue, at least continue for a while. So I think by 2030, when there are more Christians in China than in any other country, it will affect social life. It most likely will affect political life. But what kind of effect will that be? It's unclear at this time. Mm-hmm. If the government are determined to suppress, regardless, without consideration of cost, that can be disasters to Christians and to non-Christians. Just to think about Constantine back in the 4th century. They started the Great Persecution in the year 303. because at that time, Christians were about 5 to 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. And the emperors didn't like that and tried to stop it. But after 10 years, they realized they cannot be stopped.
No way to stop it.
Cannot even slow down. So by 313, Constantine had this Edict of Milan, given full freedom to Christians as well as other religions. That way, he could maintain his imperial power. So I think the impact of this in China is going to be similar. If the political leaders realize the rise of Christianity is unstoppable, if they want to keep power, they need to adjust their policy. But on the side of Christians, they do need to think carefully about what kind of church-state relations they should have, what kind of new China should be if there are so many Christians, if Christians reach 15 to 30% of the population or even higher. How do you develop a new China that will be good for Chinese, but also for neighbors, for this globalized world?
Living true Christian values.
Right. So I think there are a lot of things to think about. And the next 10 to 15 years is going to be critical in that sense. How much Chinese Christians can learn from the experiences and the lessons of Christians in other countries, and how much the Communist Party learn from historical lessons. I think this is going to be very interesting 10 to 15 years to watch.
And that's why it's so relevant, the kind of the studies that you're doing, Professor. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us in another program of Where God Weeps. If you want to know more about the situation of the church in China, we encourage you to contact the information at the end of this program. Thank you, and God bless.